Shabbos Daf Ayin Ches continues the discussion. What is the minimum size of many different materials to be significant enough that if you carry them on Shabbos in the street, you violate the Yisur D'Oraisa of carrying? So we have one Mishnah about halfway through the Daf. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah, we'll be discussing the halacha of water and what's the minimum size of water. And then the last statement we had seen in our previous Mishnah, which was that all other liquids are a revius. And we'll get to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah includes many different objects, and the Gemara will begin analyzing them one by one. We'll discuss different types of rope, and we'll discuss different types of paper, and what their minimum size is to be significant enough to be violating the Yisur D'Oraisa of carrying gar. So first of all, we're in our old Mishnah, we're discussing water. So the Mishnah had said that the smallest halacha, the smallest amount of water for which one is chayav for carrying, is enough to mix it with a eye medication called the Kilor. Now, what's going to happen now is that Abai is going to say that there is a general rule as to what the Mishnah is following. We'll have three examples as to how the Mishnah follows this rule, but in this instance, it has departed from the rule, and that'll be a kasha. And we'll have two explanations for how it really fits. So first of all, what's the rule? The rule is what happens, says Abai, when you have a material that has two potential functions. Which use do you use to determine what the minimum size to be chayav for carrying is? So Abai says it depends. If both functions are common, so then you use the stricter one, you use the smaller one, which is the stricter one, and say even if you carry out just that smaller amount, you're still violating the Yisur D'Oraisa. If, however, you have two functions, one of which is a common function, one of which is an uncommon function, then you would go with the common function to determine the minimum size, even if it ends up being a larger and more lenient size. And Abaye shows three examples of this in what we've seen in the Mishnah so far, and they are with regards to wine, milk, and honey. Now, wine has two functions, for drinking and for mixing with eye medication. But we follow the rule for drinking, even though it's more lenient, even though it's a larger share, because that is the main function of wine. Now, milk, same thing. Honey, however, its healing function is as common as its eating function, because honey has very particular restorative, curative powers, and therefore we follow the stricter, smaller share, which is the share that's used for healing. Now let's talk about water. In water, it has two functions. It has a drinking function and it has a mixing with eye medication function. How come we go with the eye medication function? That's not the main use of water. The most common use of water is drinking. So Gemara gives two answers. Abaye's answer is that here we're talking about in the Galil, where they only use water to mix their eye medications, and therefore it's very common to use it, and just as common as drinking, and that's why it's really considered that both functions are common, and we have to use the stricter one. Now, that was Abaye's answer, but Shmuel says no, you don't. Rava says you don't have to say that we're in the Galil where people are poor. Everywhere people prefer to use water for their eye medications, because if you use a different liquid to mix your eye medication into, it covers the eye, makes it difficult to see, and therefore the main thing people use eye medication mixes for is water, and therefore it is considered a common function, and it's just as common as drinking, or at least considered common, just like drinking is considered common, even if it's not as common, but they're both called common, and therefore we have to use the stricter share, which is the eye medication share. Okay. Back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that all other liquids that aren't listed specifically in the Mishnah go with the share revius. A revius of a lug, a quarter of a lug of that liquid, is significant enough to be chayav the Yisur D'Oraisa of carrying. So Gemara is going to discuss blood by bringing a brisa. Now we're going to have here three opinions about blood, what the correct share for blood is, and then we'll have another additional halacha at the end here. Okay, so first of all, we have the Tanakam who says that the share for all blood is a revius. Okay, that fits with our Mishnah that said other liquids are a revius. Now, Shimon ben Elazar says there's an exception to that, and that's the blood of a wild chicken, which is elsewhere identified with the duchifas of the psukim. So the wild chicken, his blood is useful to heal a growth in the eye. So therefore, it has a function, has that specific function, and therefore it's not with the share revius. It goes by the amount that you use to heal, to put on the eye to heal. Now, that's Rosh Hashanah Elazar. Rosh Hashanah ben Gamliel says that there's another exception to this, and that's the blood of a creature called the krushtina. What's a krushtina? Rashi describes it as a bat, We'll go with Rabbeinu Chananel, which describes it as a regular chicken, not a wild chicken. Now, what's his blood good for? It's for healing white spots in the eye. Okay, therefore that's to show the amount of blood you would use to apply to the eye to heal the white spots. Now the Gemara says, how are you going to remember which is for which? The Gemara says, inner for inner, outer for outer. White spots are in the eye, you use the inside chicken, the domestic chicken. Things that are growing out of the eye, you use the blood of the wild chicken, which is outside the realm of where most people live. Okay, now the Brisa goes further. Now the Brisa says that all these halachos don't apply across the board. These shiurim that we said, Shimon ben Elazar, who we had earlier, who says that the way we determine the significant amount of a material is by what you or anybody else stores, what you keep and save. If somebody stores a certain object and keeps it and saves it in that amount, then you're chayav for carrying for that. So what Shimon ben Elazar says is that all these halachas that we said over here is only for somebody who stores it. If is only for someone who does not store these specific things, then you go with revius. If, however, it was stored away by somebody, it was kept, so then it would be any size. If he kept it, it was kept away and was held onto, if he saved it, so then that object would be asur deraisa to carry out, even if it wasn't you who stored it, according to Shimon ben Elazar's opinion earlier in Daf Ayin Vav. Now, there, however, Reb Shimon argued. And Reb Shimon said it's got to be that most people store this amount and you store this amount. So therefore he comes up with the following halacha. He says that if you store this amount, then it goes with these shiurim. If you don't store this, if you didn't store this, then it goes by what most people do, and then it's the standard size of a revius. Okay, now I have another halacha over here, and that's what about wastewater? That's toilet water. So Gemara says that Reb Shimon and the Chachamim both agree that that's a sheer revius. Now I incorporated the next Gemara in my explanation about the storing, so we'll skip that and go to the Gemara's explanation of this wastewater. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Wastewater is a sheer revius. Wastewater, what's wastewater functional for? It's useless. The Gemara says, no, you can mix it with cement to make cement. The Gemara says, what's the size of that? Well, we said revius. The Gemara says, well, hold on a second. But we have elsewhere a discussion of what the minimum size for carrying cement is. And it's not revius, it's less than revius, because the minimum size to use for cement is enough to coat the opening of a core, which is a special oven used for melting metal. So that special oven was coated with a layer of cement that was a very tiny bit. So the amount of water you need to make that amount of cement is less than a revius. Why should the shear of wastewater that's only going to be used to make cement, why should that be a revius? So my answer is very simple. When you have already made cement, so then you'll use that little bit. And therefore that little bit of existing cement is significant enough. But water that you're going to use to make cement, you're never going to make that little cement. It's not worth the pain to start making cement for that tiny amount. The minimum amount of cement you'll make in one shot is going to be using a revius of water. And therefore the minimum share of water that's wastewater that can only be used to make cement is a revius. Okay, now we get to the next Mishnah, and the next Mishnah has a long list of various different objects and what their minimum sizes are, meaning what is minimally functional for each of these things. There's a couple of machlokes in here, so let's begin. First of all, a rope is the amount that you need to make a handle for a basket. A reed, a grassy weed, is the amount that you need to make a handle, something that you could hang a sifter or a sieve from. Now, the Gemara is going to explain why not a basket. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says there's a different function for the reed, and that's people would use it to measure their child's foot. They would have the child step on it, and they would mark off how big his foot is, and they would bring it to the shoemaker and say, make me a shoe this big. So the minimum amount for the smallest child's foot, that's how big is called significant for those reeds. Now, paper, which was made out of pressed cloth, fibers, so that's enough to make a receipt from the tax collector. Now, what about a tax collector's receipt itself? Any type of tax collector's receipt, whether it's written on paper or parchment or anything else, one is violating an asur deraisa if he carries that out in the street. Now, paper that's erased, which is not usable for writing anymore, if it's big enough to use to wrap around the top of a jar of oil, so it serves as a bottle cap, so that's a function, so that's enough paper to do that, that also counts. Now what about animal skin? That's enough to make a kemeya, an amulet. parchment, already prepared, klaf, is enough to write the smallest parsha of tefillin, which is Shema Yisrael. Ink is enough to write 2 letters. Eye makeup is enough to paint 1 eye. The Gemara will explain why 1. Glue is enough to put on the head of a board. The Gemara will explain that also. Tar is enough to make a hole, meaning for the smallest size vial that you're going to make a stopper out of hardened tar, you got to make a hole in it to let the material drip out. So that smallest size to make the stopper, that's enough to be chayav for carrying. Wax is enough to plug up a hole. Wax we use to fill the hole in wine barrels. Okay, now crushed brick is enough to make a core to melt down gold. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's enough to fix up the tripod that the gold melter would stand on. Bran, that's the shells of wheat, is enough to burn in the gold refinery. And sid, which is like lime, is enough to smear upon a girl's littlest finger to remove the hair. That's what the function of that was. Rabbi Yehuda says you could use it to put on the forehead to make the hair flatten down. And Nechami says it's enough to smear on the forehead. The Gemara will explain what that was for. Okay, so first of all, the Gemara wants to know, why is rope used only for a handle for a basket, but reeds are used for a sifter or a sieve? Why the difference? The Gemara explains because rope is hard and sharp and would cut through something wood. If you had something heavy or wood hanging from it, it would cut through it. Therefore, it can only be used for a basket. And now the Gemara quotes a brisa, and the brisa has a list of more materials and what their minimum share is. So the brisa says hutzin. Hutzin is palm branches. That's enough to make a basket. That's enough to make a handle for a basket made from palm. Now, there's a vine that grows around the palm tree. So, Rabbi Meir, or the Gemara calls him Acherim, is enough if he uses it to strain wine. That stuff is not hard enough to make into string or into rope, but he uses it as a strainer. Now, if you have fat, so that's enough to smear the bottom of a piece of bread that you plan on sticking to the side of an oven. The way they made bread was they made the dough and they slapped it on the side of the oven, and then they had to peel it off. So they smeared it with fat so they should be able to peel it off easily. Now, what's that size of that piece of bread? A small one is the size of a sell, a coin. The Gemara says 1 second, but elsewhere we said that it's a gregaris. The Gemara says gregaris and a sell are the same size. Okay, back to the brisa, we had cotton. So the small size of that is a bowl the size of a walnut. Paper, okay, so that's the end of the brisa. Now we go to a discussion of the minimum size for paper, which was the size to write a tax collector's receipt. So here we're going to have 3 brisas. The first 2 are contradictory, and we're going to look to the third one to resolve the first 2. So first of all, what's the contradiction? The brises are discussing what does a tax collector's receipt look like exactly. So in the first brise it says that it's 2 letters, that's all it was, and they were written in large letters. According to some sources it was Greek letters. Now the second brise says just 2 letters, it doesn't say large letters. So this is contradictory. Is it regular 2 letters or is it large 2 letters? What is the minimum size of this paper to be chayev the Isser Darais of carrying? Is it enough for 2 big letters or for just 2 plain letters? So Gemara has 2 solutions to this. Rav Shesha says, no, the brisa that says 2 letters also meant 2 big letters, it declined to specify. Now Rava says, no, 2 letters plus margins around it, that's the minimum size to be chayiv, and that's equal to 2 big letters without margins around it. The tax collector's sheet doesn't need to have margins. A regular writing, 2 letters has to have a margin. So those 2 things are the same. 2 regular letters with a margin is equal to 2 big letters without a margin. Somebody says they have a raya against Rava from the third brisa. Brisa says, what if you have a piece of paper that's not functional anymore? It's a used up shtar, it's a contract that's no longer valid, or it's erased, so you can't really do anything with it. So what's the minimum size for that? So there's two potential functions it could have. First of all, you could use it as a bottle cap. If it's useful for that, fine. Or if it's got margin, or you could write 2 letters in the margin, so then that's also useful, then you could use that. So Gemara says, hold on a second. Now, it says 2 letters in the margin. Now, according to Rav, you have a problem here, because this 2 letters, you can't tell me is 2 letters plus more space in the margin for a margin. You don't need a margin. The whole point of a margin is to be able to hold the paper, not on the letters. But here, you can hold the paper by the erase part. You're writing in the margin in the first place. You don't need additional margin besides that. So obviously, when it says 2 letters here, it means 2 letters without a margin. And these 2 letters is the same language that's used in the Bryce that elsewhere that says 2 letters that Rava wanted to explain is talking about with a margin. So it doesn't make sense. Obviously, when it says 2 letters, it doesn't mean 2 letters plus a margin, because here you wouldn't need 2 letters plus a margin. You have other things to hold it by. So when you're right, with Sheshis is a better explanation that 2 letters means 2 large letters, both in all 3 Bryces, even though it doesn't specify in the later 2. Okay, now we have 2 parallel Gemaras discussing when you have a document that's no longer valid and isn't really functional anymore, are you still chayev for carrying out on the street or not? Now, the general halacha is as follows, that once it's useless, there's no point in carrying it anymore if you don't need to hold on to it, so you're not chayev d'oraisa for carrying it. It's only if you need it. It's still significant that it's carrying. So we'll have 2 types of things here. It'll be a discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, whether it's still needed even though it's expired. In both cases, the Chachamim say that you don't need it anymore, so you're not chayev d'oraisa, you didn't violate the Isser d'oraisa. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you still need it, and therefore you are chayev d'Isser d'oraisa. In the first document, which is a tax collector's receipt, the Gemara will have 3 explanations as to what the machlokes is about, and in the second one, we'll have 4 explanations as to what it's about. So first of all, concerning a tax collector's receipt that is already shown to the tax collector, so you already have permission to go. So Rabbi Yehuda says you still need it, and therefore you're still chayev for carrying it. And the Chachamim say you do not. So the Gemara says what's the machlokes is about. So first explanation Abaye says is whether you are afraid that the tax collector may send somebody after you demanding to see the receipt again. That happens. Rabbi Yehuda says therefore you still have to hold on to it. And the Chachamim says no, you don't need to hold on to it for that. Next explanation, Rava says that the issue here is when you already showed it to the chief tax collector, but you may need to show it to the subordinate who might be further along the line. Rabbi Yehuda says you may need to. And the Chachamim say no, the tax collector gives you a password, that's what you could use to get by. And the third version is that what this machlokes is about is nothing to do with this is Rav Ashi. It's about whether you want to hold on to your receipt anyway, just in case you get in trouble with the tax collectors in general. At some further point, you can take out your receipt and show, look, I'm obviously a person who pays my taxes the way I'm supposed to. Okay, the next discussion is about a shtar chayv, that is a contract for a loan that has already been paid up. The loan is not collectible anymore because the leveh, the borrower, already paid the loan. Now, is it still needed? Are you still chayev for carrying it or not? So again, Rabbi Yehuda says you still need it and therefore you're chayev for carrying it. The Chachamim say no, you don't need it anymore. Therefore, it's not an Isser d'oraisa to carry it in the street. The Gemara has 4 explanations as what this machlokes is. First of all, Rabbi Yosef says this machlokes is about whether after you've already had your loan collected, you already collected your loan, are you, the lender, still allowed to hold on to the document? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're still allowed to hold on to it. You don't have a problem. You don't have to worry that you're going to collect it again because the borrower has a receipt. And therefore, you're allowed to use this thing still. It's useful. What's it useful for? As a bottle cap. I don't know. You could use it. According to the Chacham, however, you can't keep it. It's forbidden. You have to tear it up and get rid of it, lest you come to try to collect with it again. And therefore, you can't use it as a bottle cap, and therefore it's useless, and you're not chayav d'oraisa for carrying the thing in the street. That's what Yosef said. Abaye says, no, that's not the discussion over here. The discussion is when you do not have witnesses to prove that it's a valid shtar altogether. You are relying on the fact that the borrower admitted that it's a true thing, that it's not forged. And he also said that he paid it already. You don't have proof that he paid it. You don't receive it. Paid it. He said he paid it. The question is, when the only way you know that the thing is not forged is because the borrower admitted, but he also says he paid it, do you say that he's believed that he paid it, and therefore this is a useless document, and you may as well get rid of it, and you're not chayav d'oraisa for carrying it? That's what the Chachamim say. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, not necessarily. Just because I have to rely on his word that it's not forged doesn't mean that the court is going to believe him that he paid it. maybe they won't believe that he paid it, therefore it's still useful. As a matter of fact, I can still collect with it. Just because he said he paid it doesn't mean that they will believe him. He needs to bring proof. Just because the fact that he's the one who said that it's valid doesn't mean that they will believe him that he paid it, and therefore it is still collectible, and I can still hold on to it, and I still need it, and I would be chayav d'oraisa if I carried it in the street. Now we have the third pshat, which is Rava. Rava says that the argument over here is whether you could write a receipt for the borrower. Now, what's happening is that the borrower comes and he pays back his loan to the lender. The lender is supposed to give him something to prove that he paid. There's two ways of doing this. Either he could give him a receipt, or he could give him the original loan document, then he could do what he wants with it. He could rip it up, throw it out. Now, the machlokes here is based on, are you allowed to just give him the receipt? According to the Chachamim, you could just give him a receipt, so you don't have to hold on to the original paid up shtar anymore. It's useless to you, and it's not chayav d'oraisa if you carry it. Rav Yehuda says, no, you have to give him the document. You can't give him a receipt instead. You have to give him the thing itself. And therefore, you still need it. As long as you didn't give it to him, you need it because you have to give it to him. And therefore, you're chayav d'oraisa if you carry it in the street. And the last pshat is Rav Ashi, similar to what he said before. Rav Ashi says, we're not talking about the lender carrying it, we're talking about the borrower carrying it. And the borrower wants to hold on to it so that if he gets into trouble with the law in the future, he could show it in court and say, look, I have a paid up contract, and that clearly shows that I do pay my loans, and now you see that I'm a law-abiding citizen, and therefore you should trust me with whatever I'm saying here.